He knew the child was his before the world around him even finished its next breath. The city moved the way it always did on a late fall morning in Manhattan, steady streams of traffic sliding past polished glass towers, people wrapped in coats and routines, the air crisp enough to sting the lungs. But Ethan Cole didn't feel any of it when his driver slowed the car at the intersection and the world narrowed to a single point across the street where she stood. Naomi Brooks. 2 years since he had last seen her, and somehow she looked both exactly the same and entirely untouchable, like time had reshaped her into something quieter, stronger, something that didn't need to be seen to be undeniable, and in her arms was a child. The moment didn't announce itself, didn't build with warning. It simply existed, sharp and absolute, and Ethan stepped out of the car before the driver could say a word, his polished shoes hitting the pavement with a sound that felt too loud in a world that had suddenly gone still. Naomi didn't turn immediately, not when the door shut, not when he crossed half the distance between them, but when she did, it wasn't with surprise or hesitation, just a calm, measured lift of her gaze as if she had already accounted for this possibility and decided it didn't change anything. The child shifted slightly in her arms, a small movement, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to Ethan, it was like a signal flaring in the dark, and then the boy turned his head. It wasn't one feature, not just the eyes or the shape of the jaw. It was the combination, the way everything aligned in a way that didn't leave room for coincidence. The quiet familiarity of something he had seen in mirrors, in old photos, in moments he never thought would come back to confront him like this. And for a second, just a second, Ethan forgot how to breathe. The noise of the street faded into something distant, like it was happening behind glass, and all that remained was the steady, unrelenting awareness settling into his chest, heavy and undeniable. And when he finally spoke, his voice didn't carry the authority it usually did, didn't command the space around him. It came out lower, rougher, as if it had to push through something solid just to exist. How old is he? The question hung there, simple, but weighted with something far deeper than the words themselves, and Naomi didn't rush to answer, didn't shift her stance or adjust her hold on the child. She just looked at him for a moment longer, long enough for the silence to stretch, to press against him, to make him feel the absence of everything he had once controlled so easily. 2, she said finally, her tone even, unbroken, as if she were stating something that no longer held any emotional charge for her. But the number landed like a precise calculation, exact and unforgiving, lining up perfectly with a timeline Ethan knew too well, a timeline marked by decisions he had justified at the time with logic, strategy, necessity. Words that had felt solid then, but now seemed hollow in the face of something living and breathing right in front of him. His mind moved fast, too fast, piecing together fragments he hadn't allowed himself to revisit. The last conversation, the distance he had created, the silence he had chosen because it was easier, cleaner, safer for everything he was building, everything he believed he couldn't risk, and now all of it folded back into this one moment, this one undeniable reality standing across from him on a city sidewalk. He swallowed, the motion subtle but deliberate, and asked the question he already knew the answer to, because saying it out loud was the only way to make it real. Is he mine? The words didn't echo, didn't demand attention. They simply existed between them, stark and exposed. And Naomi didn't answer right away, not with a word, not with anything that could be dissected or argued. She just shifted her gaze, a small, almost imperceptible movement from Ethan to the child in her arms, and then back again, and that was enough. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't loud, but it carried more weight than any declaration could have, and Ethan felt it settle into him, final and irreversible. The boy stirred again, his small hand slipping free from the blanket wrapped around him, fingers curling slightly, as if reaching for something without understanding what it was, and for a brief, disorienting second, Ethan found himself stepping forward, not out of calculation or intent, but instinct, something deeper than logic pulling him closer, but Naomi adjusted her hold just enough. A subtle shift that created space, that redefined the distance between them without saying a word. You disappeared, she said then, her voice still calm, still controlled, but there was something in it now, not anger, not bitterness, something quieter, something that had already been processed and set aside, something that didn't need his acknowledgement to exist. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, the familiar reflex of someone used to responding, to explaining, to reclaiming control of a narrative, but the words didn't come as easily as they once would have. "It wasn't like that," he said, and even as he said it, he knew how it sounded, how insufficient it was against the simplicity of her statement, against the reality standing right in front of him. Naomi didn't react, didn't challenge him, didn't engage in the kind of back and forth he was used to navigating. She just held his gaze for a moment longer, then shifted her attention back to the child, adjusting the edge of the blanket with a care that was both ordinary and absolute. A small, everyday gesture that somehow carried more meaning than anything else in that moment. The city noise began to return, slowly, like sound seeping back into a space it had been pushed out of, horns in the distance, footsteps on pavement, voices blending into a familiar hum. But Ethan still felt like he was standing outside of it, like everything had moved on without waiting for him to catch up. "He doesn't know you," Naomi said quietly, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, just a fact, simple and unembellished. And Ethan felt something shift again, something deeper this time, something that didn't have a clear name but settled into his chest with a weight he couldn't ignore. The boy's eyes moved, curious, unfocused in the way young children are, and for a moment, they landed on Ethan, not with recognition, not with expectation, just with openness. And it was that, more than anything else, that made Ethan's breath catch, because there was no history there, no context, just the quiet, unfiltered presence of something that should have been his to know from the beginning. Naomi stepped back slightly then, not abruptly, not defensively, just enough to signal movement, to indicate that this moment, whatever it was, wasn't meant to stretch indefinitely. "Take care, Ethan," she said, and the use of his name felt different coming from her now, stripped of anything personal, reduced to something formal, distant, and before he could respond, before he could find something that might shift the direction of what was happening, she turned, her movement steady, deliberate, and started toward the waiting car at the curb. The door opened, the driver stepping forward without hesitation, and she moved with the same quiet confidence she had carried through the entire exchange, settling into the back seat with the child still held close, still centered in her world in a way that left no room for uncertainty. Ethan stood where he was, watching, the distance between them widening not just physically, but in a way that felt far more permanent. And when the door closed and the car pulled away, blending seamlessly into the flow of traffic, it didn't feel like something ending. It felt like something he had already lost long before he realized what it was worth. The city did not slow down for regret, and that was the first thing Ethan noticed as the car disappeared into traffic, as if the moment that had just shifted something fundamental inside him had no weight outside of his own chest, no impact on the rhythm of the world he had spent years mastering. And yet he stood there longer than he should have, longer than anyone in his position ever allowed himself to stand still, his hands at his sides, his breath uneven in a way that felt unfamiliar, until the sound of a passing horn pulled him back just enough to remember where he was supposed to be, who he was supposed to be, and what he was supposed to do next. But for the first time in years, the next step was not clear. The driver approached carefully, not with urgency, not with assumption, just a quiet presence waiting for instruction. And Ethan finally moved, turning without a word and sliding back into the car, the door closing with a soft, controlled sound that felt out of place against the noise in his head. And as the vehicle merged back into the flow of traffic, the reflection in the tinted window showed a version of him that looked composed, put together, untouched, but the stillness in his eyes told a different story. He did not speak during the drive, did not check his phone, did not respond to the stream of notifications that would have demanded his attention on any other day, because every thought seemed to circle back to the same point, the same image, the same realization that refused to loosen its hold. And it was not just the child, not just the undeniable resemblance. It was the timing, the precision of it, the way everything aligned with a decision he had made, and then buried under layers of justification until it no longer felt like something that could return to confront him. And now it had, not as an abstract consequence, but as a living presence he could not ignore. The car pulled into the underground garage of Coal Industries, the familiar descent into polished concrete and controlled lighting, a space designed for efficiency, for privacy, for the seamless transition from public to private without disruption, and Ethan stepped out with the same measured pace he always did, acknowledging the nods of security, the quiet greetings of staff, but none of it registered the way it used to. None of it anchored him the way it should have, because the control he had built his entire life around felt thinner now, less absolute, as if something had slipped through a crack he did not know existed. His office sat on the top floor, glass walls framing a skyline he had once looked at as proof of everything he had achieved, every risk calculated, every move executed with precision. And as he stepped inside, the space responded the way it always did, lights adjusting, screens coming to life, information ready at a glance, a world that functioned exactly as he designed it to, and yet it felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to the clarity of the moment he could not stop replaying. He moved to the desk, placed his hands on the edge, and for a second, just a second, he closed his eyes, not to rest, not to escape, but to see it again, to make sure it was not something his mind had exaggerated. And it was not. It was exactly the same quiet street corner, the same steady presence of Naomi, the same child whose face carried a truth Ethan had not been prepared to face. 2 years. The number settled again, precise and unyielding, and with it came a memory he had not allowed himself to revisit in any meaningful way, not because it was dramatic or explosive, but because it was quiet, controlled, easy to rationalize at the time, the kind of decision that fit neatly into the life he was building. He had left without creating a scene, without offering an explanation that would complicate things, because from his perspective, the path forward required distance, required focus, required the removal of anything that might disrupt the trajectory he had set for himself, and Naomi had been part of a life that did not align with that trajectory. At least that was what he told himself, what he believed enough to act on without hesitation, and for a long time, it had worked. He straightened, opened his eyes, and reached for his phone, the motion automatic, practiced, but the purpose behind it was different now, less about managing the world around him and more about finding a way back to something he had already lost, and he scrolled through contacts, through names that represented power, influence, access, until he stopped, not because he found what he was looking for, but because he realized he had never kept a connection to her, never left a thread that could be followed, because at the time, that had been the point. He exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier than he intended, and pressed a single button. "Marcus," he said when the line connected, his voice steady but carrying an edge that did not belong to urgency or anger, something quieter, more focused. "I need information." There was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation, just the quick recalibration of an assistant who knew how to adjust to whatever was required without question. "Of course, sir," Marcus replied. "Who are we looking for?" Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not know, but because saying her name now felt different than it had in the past, less casual, more deliberate, like acknowledging something he had once chosen to dismiss. "Naomi Brooks," he said finally. "I need her current address, any recent activity, anything you can find." Another pause, slightly longer this time, but still controlled. "Understood," Marcus said. "I will have something for you shortly." The line ended, and Ethan set the phone down, his gaze drifting to the skyline beyond the glass, the city stretching out in every direction, full of movement, full of lives intersecting in ways he had always been able to anticipate, to influence, to navigate, and yet this one intersection, this one unexpected collision, had shifted something he could not map out with the same certainty. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, and when the phone buzzed again, Ethan picked it up immediately, not with impatience, but with a focus that had narrowed to a single point. "Sir," Marcus began, his tone precise, efficient. "I have located her. Naomi Brooks currently resides in Brooklyn. No public records indicating a partner or spouse. Employment history shows freelance consulting, minimal digital footprint, very deliberate." Ethan listened without interruption, absorbing each detail, not as data to be categorized, but as pieces of a life that had continued without him, a life that had been built in quiet, in independence, in a way that did not require his presence or his approval. "And the child?" Ethan asked, the question coming out lower, more measured. "No official records linking a father," Marcus replied. "Birth certificate lists Naomi Brooks as the sole parent." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, not in frustration, but in the recognition of what that meant, the absence of his name not just on paper, but in the structure of a life that had formed entirely without him. "I want a meeting scheduled," Ethan said, the decision forming as he spoke it, not as a command rooted in habit, but as a necessity he could no longer ignore. "No," he corrected himself almost immediately, the shift subtle but significant. "Do not schedule it. Just give me the address." There was a brief silence, the kind that signaled adjustment, understanding. "Yes, sir," Marcus said. "I will send it now." The message arrived within seconds, a simple line of text containing information that should have been easy to obtain, easy to act on. And yet Ethan did not move right away, did not reach for his coat or call for the car, because for the first time, the next step was not just about access, it was about consequence, about stepping into a reality where he did not control the outcome, where the person on the other side of that door had every reason to refuse him, to close that space before he could even begin to explain. He picked up the phone again, looked at the address, and then at his reflection in the glass. The man who had built everything on certainty, on decisions that left no room for doubt, and now stood at the edge of something that did not follow those rules, something that could not be negotiated or acquired or resolved with a signature or a strategy. And as he turned toward the door, finally moving with intent, it was not with the confidence he had always carried, but with something quieter, something heavier, the first step of a man who understood, perhaps too late, that some things could not be reclaimed simply because he had decided they should be. The address sat on his phone like a line he could not unread, a simple string of numbers and a street name in Brooklyn that felt far more significant than any contract he had signed in the last decade. And Ethan stared at it longer than he needed to, not because he doubted its accuracy, but because he understood what stepping into that location would mean, a shift from controlled distance to undeniable presence, from observation to consequence. And yet his feet moved before his thoughts fully settled, his coat lifted from the back of the chair, his stride steady as he crossed the office and ignored the subtle glances from staff who were not used to seeing him leave without a scheduled block of time attached to it. The elevator ride down was silent except for the low hum of machinery and the faint reflection of his face in the brushed steel walls, composed as always. But there was something different beneath the surface, something less certain, and when the doors opened into the lobby, the world resumed its pace around him, assistants moving quickly, conversations clipped and efficient, but none of it reached him the way it normally did, because his focus had narrowed to a single destination that did not fit into the systems he had built. The drive across the bridge stretched longer than it should have, traffic inching forward in measured bursts, the skyline shifting behind him as Manhattan gave way to Brooklyn, a transition he had made countless times in business contexts. But this felt different, less transactional, more personal in a way that stripped away the distance he usually maintained, and he found himself watching the city more closely than usual, the smaller buildings, the quieter streets, the details he rarely had time to notice, as if understanding the environment might prepare him for what waited at the end of it. The car slowed as it approached the address, a modest brownstone tucked between others that looked lived in, cared for, not extravagant but intentional, and Ethan remained seated for a moment after the engine idled, his hand resting on the door handle without pulling it open, a brief pause that spoke less of hesitation and more of awareness, because once he stepped out, there would be no undoing it, no returning to the version of events where he had not seen what he saw, had not realized what he now knew. He stepped out anyway, the air cooler here, less filtered by glass and steel, carrying the faint sounds of neighborhood life, a distant conversation, a door closing somewhere down the block, and he moved toward the building with the same measured pace he carried into boardrooms, but the purpose behind it felt entirely different. The front steps were clean, the railing steady under his hand as he climbed, and when he reached the door, he paused again, not long, just enough to register the simplicity of the moment, a man standing outside a door that separated him from a life he had not been part of, and then he knocked. The sound echoed softly inside, followed by a brief silence that stretched just long enough to make him aware of his own breathing, and then footsteps approached, light, unhurried, and the door opened. Naomi stood there, framed by the warm light of the interior, her expression unchanged from earlier, calm, composed, as if his presence here was not unexpected, not disruptive, just another fact to acknowledge without allowing it to shift her balance. For a second, neither of them spoke, the space between them holding the weight of everything unsaid, everything that could not be simplified into a single explanation or apology. And then she stepped slightly to the side, not an invitation exactly, but not in refusal either. "You found the address," she said, her voice even, carrying no surprise, no accusation, just observation. Ethan nodded once, a small, controlled movement. "I needed to see you," he replied, the words straightforward, but lacking the certainty he would have attached to them in any other context. Naomi studied him for a moment, her gaze steady, assessing without judgment, and then she turned, moving back into the house with the quiet assurance of someone who was not concerned about being followed, because the space was hers, the ground was hers, and Ethan stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a soft click that felt more final than it should have. The interior was simple but warm, sunlight filtering through curtains that softened the edges of the room, furniture arranged with purpose rather than display, and there were small details that caught his attention without asking for it. A folded blanket on the couch, a stack of children's books on a low table, a toy car resting near the edge of the rug, signs of a life that moved at a different pace than his, built around different priorities. And it was in those details that the reality of the past 2 years settled deeper, more tangible than any report or summary could have conveyed. "He is asleep," Naomi said, glancing briefly down the hallway, her voice lowering slightly, not out of secrecy, but out of habit, the natural adjustment of someone who was attuned to another presence in the house. Ethan followed her gaze, the simple statement carrying more weight than it should have, because it implied routine, familiarity, moments he had not witnessed, and he nodded again, unsure of what to say that would not sound insufficient. Naomi moved toward the kitchen, pouring a glass of water without asking if he wanted one, then setting it on the counter within reach, a small gesture that acknowledged his presence without prioritizing it. And when she turned back to him, her posture was relaxed, grounded, as if she had already decided how much space this conversation would be allowed to take. "Why are you here, Ethan?" she asked, the question direct, without edge, but impossible to avoid. He exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but carrying the weight of everything he had been trying to organize into something coherent since the moment he saw her. "I did not know," he said, and the words felt incomplete even as he spoke them, because they addressed only part of the reality, the absence of knowledge, not the absence of action. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in disbelief, but in acknowledgement of the statement as it was, neither accepting nor rejecting it outright. "You did not ask," she replied, her tone unchanged, the correction simple, precise, and far more accurate than anything he had said. The distinction landed, quiet but undeniable, and Ethan felt it settle into him with the same weight as everything else, because it was not just about what he had not known, it was about what he had chosen not to know, the distance he had created and then maintained because it aligned with the version of his life he believed he needed. "I made decisions," he said, the admission measured, careful, but lacking the usual layer of justification he would have added in any other setting. Naomi's gaze held his, steady, unflinching. "You did," she said, and there was no anger in it, no accusation, just confirmation, as if she had already moved past the point where those decisions required an emotional response. A faint sound came from down the hallway then, soft, indistinct, but enough to shift Naomi's attention immediately, her body turning slightly toward it, her awareness recalibrating in an instant, and Ethan felt something tighten in his chest at the simplicity of that reaction, the instinctive prioritization of someone else over everything else in the room. The sound came again, a little clearer this time, the small, waking stir of a child, and Naomi moved without hesitation. "Stay here," she said quietly, not as a command, but as a boundary, and she disappeared down the hallway before he could respond. Ethan remained where he was, the space suddenly quieter, heavier, filled with the awareness of what was about to happen, and for the first time since he had arrived, he did not move at all, did not adjust his stance or reach for anything. He just stood there, listening to the faint sounds beyond the doorway, the soft murmur of a voice he had not heard before, the gentle rhythm of someone being comforted, and he understood, with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, that whatever came next would not be something he could control, only something he would have to face. The house held its breath in a way that felt deliberate, like even the walls understood that something irreversible was about to happen, and Ethan stood exactly where Naomi had left him, his posture still, his attention fixed on the hallway where her voice had softened into something entirely different than the calm control she had shown him, something warmer, instinctive, a tone shaped by repetition and care rather than restraint, and the faint murmur of it carried into the room in fragments. He could not fully make out, but could feel. And then there was a second voice, smaller, unformed, the uneven rhythm of a child waking from sleep, and it was that sound, more than anything else, that shifted the air around him, that made everything he had been holding in place feel less stable. He did not move closer, did not step into the hallway, because the boundary she had set was clear, and for the first time in a long time, he respected it without question, standing there with his hands at his sides, listening as the quiet exchange unfolded just out of sight, the soft reassurance, the gentle cadence of someone guiding another back into comfort, and he realized, not as a distant concept, but as a present reality, that there were entire moments, entire routines, entire versions of life happening in that house that had never included him, not even in the smallest way. The footsteps returned after a minute, slow and steady, and Naomi appeared at the end of the hallway with the child in her arms, his head resting against her shoulder, his small fingers curled into the fabric of her sweater as if it was the most natural anchor in the world. And when she stepped fully into the light, Ethan saw him again, not from across a street this time, not through distance or shock, but clearly, undeniably. And the resemblance did not lessen, did not blur with proximity. It sharpened, every detail aligning in a way that made it impossible to look away. The boy lifted his head slightly, his eyes still heavy with sleep, unfocused at first, drifting across the room until they landed on Ethan, and there was a pause, a small, quiet moment where nothing moved, where the recognition was not conscious, not formed by understanding, but something else, something instinctive, and Ethan felt it like a weight pressing into his chest. Naomi adjusted her hold, one arm supporting the child with practiced ease, her other hand brushing lightly over his back in a motion that seemed automatic, and she did not rush the moment, did not shield the child or step away. She simply stood there, allowing the reality of it to exist without embellishment. "This is Caleb," she said finally, her voice steady, the introduction simple, without ceremony, but carrying a significance that settled into the space between them. Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he did not hear, but because the name, the presence, the clarity of it all required a second to process, to align with everything else he had learned in the last 24 hours. And when he did speak, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of anything that resembled authority. "Caleb," he repeated, the word unfamiliar on his tongue in this context, and the boy's eyes remained on him, curious now, more awake, studying him in the unfiltered way children do, without expectation, without judgment, just observing. Naomi took a small step forward, closing some of the distance but not all of it, maintaining a space that was intentional, controlled, and Ethan did not move to meet her, did not reach out, because he understood, even without being told, that this was not a moment he could claim, only one he could be allowed to witness. Caleb shifted again, his small hand lifting from Naomi's shoulder, hovering for a second as if testing the air, and then extending slightly in Ethan's direction, not fully, not with certainty, but enough to register as an instinctive reach, and the simplicity of that gesture, the absence of history behind it, the openness of it, landed harder than anything else had so far. Ethan's hand moved before he could fully consider it, a small, controlled motion, stopping just short of closing the space, because he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because this was not something he could take without permission, and he looked at Naomi, not with expectation, but with a question he did not voice. Naomi watched the exchange, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and after a brief moment, she gave a slight nod, not encouraging, not discouraging, just allowing, and that was enough. Ethan extended his hand the rest of the way, slow, deliberate, and Caleb's fingers closed around one of his. The grip light but present, the contact brief but undeniable, and something in Ethan's chest shifted again, deeper this time, more permanent, because this was no longer abstract, no longer a realization based on resemblance or timing. It was tangible, immediate, something that existed in the space between them in a way that could not be dismissed. The moment did not last long, Caleb's attention already beginning to drift, his focus shifting back to Naomi, his body leaning instinctively toward her as she adjusted him again, and Ethan let his hand fall back to his side, the absence of that small contact more noticeable than it should have been. "He likes people," Naomi said quietly, not as an explanation, not as a reassurance, just a simple observation that carried its own boundaries, and Ethan nodded, though. He was not sure what the appropriate response was, because there was nothing about this that followed the patterns he was used to navigating. "He should know me," Ethan said then, the words coming out before he had fully shaped them, not as a demand, not as a declaration, but as something closer to a realization spoken aloud, and the room seemed to shift slightly around that statement, the weight of it settling into the space between them. Naomi's gaze held his, steady, unflinching, and there was a pause, not long, but long enough for the meaning of what he had said to fully register. "He will know what he is ready to know," she replied, her tone calm, controlled, but firm in a way that left no room for interpretation, and Ethan felt the distinction immediately, the difference between what he believed should happen and what she was allowing to happen, the shift in control that he could not override. He exhaled slowly, the sound measured, and nodded once, not in agreement exactly, but in acknowledgement, because arguing would not change the structure of this reality, would not alter the fact that he was entering something that had already been built without him. Caleb let out a small sound then, a soft, indistinct murmur, and Naomi smiled slightly, the expression subtle but real, a glimpse of something warmer that had not been directed at Ethan at all, and she turned slightly, adjusting the child against her shoulder with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. "He is hungry," she said, almost to herself, though the words carried into the room, and she moved toward the kitchen without waiting for a response, her focus shifting entirely to the child in her arms. Ethan remained where he was, watching her go, the scene unfolding in front of him in a way that felt both ordinary and entirely foreign. The small routines, the quiet priorities, the life that had formed in his absence, and for the first time, he understood that this was not something he could step into and reshape, not something he could adjust to fit the structure of his world. It was something he would have to learn, slowly, carefully, if he was allowed at all. And as he stood there, listening to the soft sounds of Naomi moving in the kitchen, the faint clink of a glass, the low murmur of her voice as she spoke to Caleb in a tone that did not belong to him, he realized with a clarity that left no room for denial that the truth he had discovered was only the beginning, not the resolution, and that everything that came after would require more than recognition. It would require something he had not yet proven he was capable of giving. The quiet rhythm of the kitchen settled into something steady, almost grounding, as Naomi moved with a familiarity that came from repetition, from days and nights shaped around a child who depended on her in ways that did not pause for anything else. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer before he allowed himself to follow, not with urgency, not with entitlement, but with a measured step that acknowledged he was entering a space that had not been built for him. The kitchen was small compared to what he was used to, but it carried a warmth that did not rely on size or design. Sunlight resting across the counter, a kettle near the stove, a quiet order that spoke of function rather than display. And Naomi stood at the sink, one hand steadying Caleb against her shoulder while the other moved with efficiency, filling a small cup, testing the temperature with a brief touch, every motion precise without needing attention. Caleb's soft sounds had shifted into something more alert now, small, curious murmurs as he watched the movement around him, his eyes occasionally drifting back toward Ethan, not with recognition but with interest, the simple openness of someone who had not yet learned to guard his attention. Ethan stopped a few feet away, careful not to close the space too quickly, his presence there acknowledged but not centered, and for a second he simply observed, the scene unfolding in a way that felt both ordinary and entirely unfamiliar, because it was not structured, not scheduled, not controlled by anything other than need and response. "You built all of this," he said quietly, the words not framed as a question, more an observation that carried weight, because he understood now that this life, every part of it, existed because she had made it exist. Naomi did not turn immediately, did not shift her focus from what she was doing, and when she spoke, her tone remained even. "I lived it," she replied, a subtle distinction that settled between them, one that did not seek recognition, only accuracy. Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing the difference, because building suggested intention and control, while living carried something deeper, something less calculated and more constant, and he realized that the gap between those two ideas was exactly where he had been absent. Caleb let out a small sound again, his body shifting with a gentle restlessness, and Naomi adjusted him with ease, her movements instinctive, her attention unwavering, and when she finally turned, holding the cup in one hand, her gaze met Ethan's again, steady, grounded. "You can sit," she said, nodding slightly toward the small table near the window, not as an invitation to stay, but as an acknowledgement that he was there, that this moment was not ending immediately. Ethan moved as she indicated, pulling out the chair with a quiet motion, the simple act feeling different here than it did anywhere else, because it was not part of a larger system of behavior. It was just a seat in a room where life was happening without him. He sat, his posture straight but less rigid than usual, his hands resting lightly on the table, and he watched as Naomi settled into the chair across from him. Caleb now more awake, his attention moving between them, the space between adult awareness and childlike curiosity, creating a dynamic Ethan could not predict. "I should have been there," Ethan said after a moment, the words coming without the usual framing he would apply, no strategy, no careful positioning, just a statement that felt necessary to say out loud. Naomi did not react immediately, her gaze shifting briefly to Caleb as she offered him the cup, guiding his small hands with patience, and when she looked back at Ethan, there was no sharpness in her expression, only a quiet certainty. "You were not," she said simply, the truth delivered without weight but impossible to soften, and Ethan felt it settle into him with a clarity that did not leave room for interpretation. He inhaled slowly, the breath measured, and nodded again, because there was nothing to argue, nothing to correct, only something to accept. "I did not know," he repeated, softer this time, not as a defense, but as a reflection of where his understanding had been, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "You chose not to know," she replied, the correction consistent, steady, and Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not to escape, but to acknowledge the accuracy of it, the difference between absence and avoidance, between not being told and not asking. Caleb's small voice broke through the moment, a simple sound that carried no weight beyond its existence, and Naomi smiled faintly, her attention returning to him fully, her hand brushing lightly against his cheek in a gesture that spoke of familiarity, of care repeated enough times to become second nature, and Ethan watched that interaction with a focus that felt almost involuntary, because it represented something he had not only missed, but something he had never even considered in its full reality. "He has a routine," Naomi said after a moment, not as an explanation for Ethan, but as a statement of fact, her voice calm, steady. "He eats, he plays, he sleeps. It is not complicated." Ethan nodded, though the simplicity of it felt more complex to him than anything he had managed in his professional life, because it was not built on negotiation or leverage. It was built on consistency, on presence, on showing up in the same way every day without fail. "I want to be part of that," Ethan said, the words coming more carefully this time, shaped by the awareness that what he was asking for was not something he could claim, and Naomi held his gaze, the pause that followed carrying more meaning than any immediate response could have. "Wanting is easy," she said quietly, her tone not dismissive, but grounded in something that did not shift with intention alone. "Being there is not." The distinction settled into the room, clear, unchallenged, and Ethan felt the weight of it more than anything else she had said so far, because it moved the conversation away from realization and into expectation, away from acknowledgement and into action. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the movement subtle, his eyes moving briefly to the window where the light had shifted just enough to mark the passage of time, and then back to Naomi, to Caleb, to the life that continued to exist regardless of his presence in it. "Tell me what that looks like," he said finally, his voice steady, not demanding, not assuming, but asking in a way that suggested he understood this was not his to define. And Naomi studied him for a moment, her gaze searching not for words, but for consistency behind them, for something that would not disappear the way he once had. Caleb reached for her then, his small hands wrapping around her fingers, grounding the moment in something immediate, something real, and Naomi exhaled softly, her attention shifting between the child and the man sitting across from her, the past and the present aligning in a way that could not be separated. "It looks like time," she said at last, her voice quiet but firm. "Not a visit, not a decision. Time." Ethan nodded slowly, the words settling into him with a weight that felt both simple and overwhelming. Because time was something he had always controlled, always allocated with precision, and now it was being presented to him in a form that required something entirely different, something that could not be measured or optimized, only given. And as he sat there, in a kitchen that was not his, watching a life that had grown without him, he understood that whatever came next would not be about proving something in a single moment. It would be about showing up in ways he had never needed to before, over and over again, without certainty, without guarantee, and that realization, more than anything else, was the point where everything truly began. Time did not pause for him to understand it, and that became clear in the way the minutes continued to move forward inside that kitchen, in the quiet rhythm of Caleb finishing his drink, in the soft clink of the cup as Naomi set it aside, in the subtle shift of light through the window that marked the day continuing weather. Ethan was ready or not, and he sat there with the weight of her words settling deeper than anything else that had been said, because time was not something he could negotiate, not something he could accelerate, not something he could replace with intention or resources. It was something he would have to earn through presence, and that realization sat heavy in his chest as he watched Naomi stand, lifting Caleb with a smooth, practiced motion, her hand resting gently against his back as she moved toward the living room without asking if Ethan would follow, because this was not about including him. It was about continuing what already existed. Ethan rose after a brief moment, not wanting to disrupt the flow of what she was doing, but also not willing to remain removed from it, and he followed at a distance that felt appropriate, careful not to close the space too quickly, his attention fixed on the way Caleb's head rested against Naomi's shoulder, the quiet trust in that posture, the kind of trust that did not form in a single moment, but over countless small, consistent ones. The living room felt even more lived in than before, the afternoon light stretching across the rug, catching on the edges of toys that had been left in place, not as clutter, but as evidence of a life unfolding naturally. And Naomi lowered Caleb onto the floor with care, kneeling beside him as he adjusted, his small hands immediately reaching for a toy car near the edge of the rug, his attention shifting fully into the simple world of movement and curiosity that defined his age. Ethan remained standing for a second longer before he moved closer, not directly into Caleb's space, but near enough to observe without imposing. And he found himself watching something he had never paid attention to before, the way a child engaged with the world, the focus, the trial and error, the quiet determination in movements that seemed insignificant but were entirely consuming to the one making them. "He likes that one," Naomi said quietly, her eyes on Caleb as he pushed the small car forward, then pulled it back, repeating the motion with growing confidence, and Ethan nodded, though the comment was simple. Because it was not about the toy, it was about the familiarity behind it, the knowledge that came from being there enough times to notice patterns. "Does he talk much?" Ethan asked, the question coming carefully, not wanting to disrupt the moment, but needing to understand, and Naomi glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to Caleb. "He says a few words," she replied, "mostly when he wants something or when he recognizes someone." The implication in that statement was subtle but clear, and Ethan felt it settle into him without resistance, because recognition required time, required presence, required something he had not given. Caleb looked up then, his eyes moving between the two adults, and he made a small sound, not quite a word, but something close, something exploratory, and Naomi smiled faintly, her hand brushing lightly over his hair. "Can you say hi?" she prompted gently, her tone encouraging but not forcing, and Caleb's gaze lingered on Ethan for a second longer before he turned back to the toy. The moment passing without completion, and Ethan felt a quiet shift in his chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, but present enough to register, because it was not rejection, it was simply absence, the absence of familiarity, of connection, of anything that would make that word come naturally. He lowered himself onto the chair nearby, the movement slow, deliberate, and for a moment he said nothing, allowing the silence to exist without trying to fill it, because he was beginning to understand that not every space needed his voice, not every moment required his input, and that realization alone felt like a shift from the way he had always operated. Naomi remained on the floor beside Caleb, her posture relaxed, grounded, her attention steady in a way that did not waver, and Ethan watched the interaction between them, the small exchanges, the way she responded to his movements without thinking, the way Caleb leaned toward her without hesitation, and it became clear in a way that was almost physical, the difference between being present and simply wanting to be. "I do not expect this to change overnight," Ethan said after a while, his voice low, measured. The words chosen with more care than anything he had said before, because they were not about asserting anything, they were about acknowledging reality. Naomi did not look up immediately, her focus still on Caleb as he shifted positions, his small hands pressing against the rug as he balanced himself, and when she did respond, her tone remained even. "It will not," she said, the certainty in her voice not harsh, but grounded in truth, and Ethan nodded, accepting it without resistance, because he knew she was right. "Then I will start where I am," he continued, the statement simple, but carrying intention, and Naomi's gaze flickered toward him briefly, assessing, measuring not the words themselves, but the consistency behind them, something she would not be able to determine in a single conversation. Caleb pushed the toy car toward Ethan then, the small movement almost accidental, the car rolling just enough to reach the edge of the space between them, and both adults noticed it at the same time, the moment small, but significant in its own quiet way. Ethan looked at the car, then at Caleb, and for a second he did not move, because he understood that even something this simple carried weight, not in the action itself, but in what it represented, and then he reached forward slowly, picking up the car with a careful motion, his eyes remaining on Caleb as he rolled it gently back across the rug. Caleb watched the movement, his attention drawn to the return, and he let out a small sound again, this time more animated, his hand reaching forward to catch the car as it came back to him, and Naomi's expression softened slightly, not with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement of the exchange. Ethan did not smile, did not overreact. He simply sat there, his hand resting on his knee, allowing the moment to exist without trying to shape it into something more. And for the first time since he had arrived, there was something that felt less like distance and more like the beginning of a connection, not defined, not secure, but present. The light in the room shifted again, the afternoon moving forward, and Naomi rose to her feet, brushing her hands lightly against her jeans, her attention returning to the rhythm of the day. "He will need to nap soon," she said, her tone practical, not dismissive, but indicating the structure that guided everything here, and Ethan stood as well, the motion automatic, but his awareness remained focused on what she had said earlier, on time, on presence, on the understanding that this was not something he could claim in a single visit. "I will come back," he said, the statement quiet, not framed as a question, not expecting confirmation, but offering something that would only hold meaning if it was followed through, and Naomi met his gaze, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. "We will see," she replied, the words neither accepting nor rejecting, simply leaving space for what would come next, and Ethan nodded once, because he understood that this was not about convincing her in this moment. It was about showing up in the ones that followed, over and over again, without fail, and as he turned toward the door, the quiet sounds of the house continuing behind him, he carried with him something far heavier than when he had arrived, not just the truth he had discovered, but the responsibility that came with it, one that could not be delegated, could not be accelerated, only lived, one moment at a time. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that felt louder than it should have, not because of the sound itself, but because of what it marked, a transition from a space where something real had begun to a world where everything had always been controlled, predictable, structured to respond to him. And as Ethan stepped back onto the sidewalk, the air felt different, sharper somehow, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the ordinary movement of a neighborhood that had no awareness of what had just shifted inside him. He did not call for the car immediately, did not reach for his phone. He simply stood there for a moment, his gaze lingering on the brownstone behind him, on the door that separated him from a life that had already formed its own rhythm. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to stand still without a plan forming instantly in his mind. The weight of it was not overwhelming, but it was steady, persistent, the kind of awareness that did not fade with distraction. And when he finally moved, it was with a quiet intention that felt unfamiliar, less about control and more about direction. The ride back into Manhattan passed in silence, the city rising again around him in glass and steel, the familiar skyline reclaiming its place in his field of vision. But something about it felt altered, not because the buildings had changed, but because his perspective had shifted just enough to make the contrast impossible to ignore. When the car pulled into the underground garage, everything resumed its expected pace, the subtle efficiency of movement, the quiet acknowledgement from security, the seamless transition into a world where time was measured, optimized, controlled, and Ethan stepped back into it without hesitation, but not without awareness, because the clarity he had gained did not dissolve just because he had returned to familiar ground. His office welcomed him with the same precision as always, the lights adjusting, the screens coming to life, information ready and waiting. And for a moment he stood there, looking at it all, the culmination of years of decisions, of calculated risks, of sacrifices he had once believed were necessary. And he understood now that those sacrifices had not been abstract. They had been specific, tangible, and they had led directly to the absence he was now trying to reconcile. His phone buzzed almost immediately, the steady stream of communication that defined his position resuming without pause. Emails, messages, requests, all demanding attention, and under normal circumstances, he would have engaged without hesitation, moving from one task to the next with efficiency. But this time, he did something different. He let it sit for a moment longer, his gaze shifting instead to the window, to the city beyond, and then back to the phone in his hand. He tapped the screen, not to respond to any of the incoming messages, but to open his calendar, the grid of time blocks laid out in precise increments, each hour accounted for, each day structured to maximize output. And he stared at it for a second, the pattern clear, predictable, and then he began to move things, not randomly, not without thought, but deliberately, creating space where there had been none, adjusting meetings, delegating decisions, shifting priorities in a way that would have seemed inefficient to anyone else. But to him, it felt necessary. Marcus appeared at the doorway a few minutes later, his presence as composed as ever, his posture reflecting the expectation that Ethan would resume his usual pace. And for a moment he hesitated, taking in the subtle difference in the room, the slight disruption in the rhythm he was accustomed to. "Sir, you have a call in 10 minutes with the board," Marcus said, his tone neutral, professional, but there was a slight pause at the end, as if he was waiting for confirmation rather than assuming it. Ethan glanced at the clock, then back at the calendar, and then at Marcus, his expression steady, but his decision already made. "Reschedule it," he said, his voice calm, without urgency, without explanation, and Marcus blinked once, a rare break in his usual composure, not because the request was impossible, but because it was unexpected. "Reschedule," Ethan repeated, more quietly this time, and Marcus nodded, adjusting instantly, his mind already moving through the logistics. "Of course, sir," he replied, stepping back to carry out the instruction without further question. Ethan turned back to the window, his reflection faint against the glass, and for a moment he allowed himself to consider the implications of what he had just done, not in terms of business impact, but in terms of personal shift, because this was not something he would have done before, not without a strategic reason that aligned with measurable outcomes. And yet this time, the reason was something else entirely, something that did not fit into his usual framework. He reached for his phone again, not to check messages, not to review reports, but to open a simple note, a blank space where he typed a single word. Caleb, and he looked at it for a second, the name carrying more weight now than it had when he first heard it, because it was no longer just information, it was a connection he could not ignore. The rest of the day moved differently, not slower, but with a shift in focus that affected every interaction, every decision. Because even as he engaged with his responsibilities, even as he responded to what was required of him, there was a part of his attention that remained anchored elsewhere, in a smaller space, with quieter sounds, with a child who did not know him yet, and a woman who had built a life without waiting for him to return. By the time the evening approached, the city outside had shifted again, the light fading into something softer, the movement taking on a different rhythm, and Ethan stood once more at the window, his office now quieter, the demands of the day settling into a manageable silence, and he reached for his phone again, this time not hesitating. He did not call, did not send a message, because he understood that this was not something to rush, not something to push, and instead, he opened the calendar again, moving through the days ahead, marking out time, not for meetings, not for obligations, but for something else, something that would require consistency, patience, presence. And as he set those blocks in place, not knowing exactly how they would be received, not knowing what each visit would bring, he understood that this was only the beginning, that the real work was not in the realization, but in what came after, in the repeated choice to show up, to remain, to build something slowly in a space where he held no control. And as he stood there, looking out at a city he had once believed he fully understood, he realized that for the first time, he was stepping into something that would not respond to power or strategy, only to time. And that was something he would have to learn, one moment at a time. Morning arrived without waiting for him to feel ready for it. The city already awake by the time Ethan stepped out of his building. The air carrying that early sharpness that sat somewhere between cold and clean. And for a moment he stood there with his coat buttoned, his gaze lifting toward the skyline he had once used as a measure of progress, as proof of control. And now it felt like something else entirely, something that existed independently of him, something that did not adjust to his decisions the way it once had. The car door opened beside him, the driver waiting as always, but Ethan did not get in immediately, his attention shifting instead to his phone where the calendar sat open, the blocks of time he had rearranged the night before still visible, still deliberate, and he exhaled slowly before sliding into the seat. Not with the urgency of a man chasing a schedule, but with the steadiness of someone stepping into something that required consistency rather than speed. The drive into Manhattan passed as it always did, traffic building in waves, the sound of horns blending into a constant rhythm, people moving with purpose, but Ethan's attention did not settle into his usual routine of calls and messages. Instead it stayed quiet, his mind returning again and again to a smaller space in Brooklyn, to the sound of a child's voice forming incomplete words, to the steady presence of Naomi who had not asked for anything from him but time, and even that had not been framed as a request, only a condition. By the time he reached the office, the building was already in motion, employees moving through the lobby with practiced efficiency, screens lighting up across floors, the hum of productivity rising in layers, and Ethan stepped into it as he always did, acknowledged, expected, central to its operation. But something about his movement was different now, less reactive, more intentional, as if each step had been considered rather than assumed. The elevator carried him up in silence, his reflection steady in the mirrored walls, and when the doors opened into his office, the space responded the same way it always had, lights adjusting, systems activating, everything aligning to serve his presence. And for a moment he stood there again, taking it in, not with pride or detachment, but with a kind of clarity that made him see both what it was and what it was not. His phone buzzed almost immediately, a call from Marcus, and Ethan answered without hesitation, his voice calm, controlled. "Good morning, sir," Marcus said, his tone as precise as ever. "Your morning has been adjusted per your instructions. The board call has been moved to this afternoon, and your schedule reflects the changes." Ethan glanced at the calendar again, the open space still there, still intentional. "Thank you," he replied, and there was a brief pause on the other end before Marcus continued. "There is one more item," he added. "A message came through late last night. It is from Naomi Brooks." Ethan did not move, but something in his posture shifted, his attention sharpening without urgency. "Send it," he said, his voice steady, and the message appeared on his screen seconds later, simple, direct, without embellishment. It was not long, just a few lines, but it carried more weight than any of the emails waiting in his inbox. She had written that Caleb would be at the park near their building at 10 in the morning, that it was part of his routine, and that if Ethan intended to come back, that was where he could start. There was no invitation in the words, no expectation, only information, offered without pressure, and Ethan read it twice, not because it was complex, but because he understood what it meant, not just the opportunity, but the boundary within it. "Cancel the rest of the morning," Ethan said quietly into the phone, his gaze still on the message. Marcus did not hesitate. "Understood," he replied, already adjusting, already moving through the logistics that would make it possible, and the call ended without further discussion. Ethan set the phone down for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the desk, and then he moved, not quickly, not abruptly, but with a clear sense of direction, his coat lifted again, his steps steady as he left the office without the usual cascade of instructions that would follow, because this time, there was nothing to delegate, nothing to manage, only somewhere to be. The drive back across the bridge felt different than it had the day before, not because the traffic had changed, but because his role within it had shifted from observer to participant, from someone reacting to a moment to someone choosing to return to it. And when the car slowed near the park Naomi had mentioned, Ethan stepped out before the driver could fully stop, his eyes scanning the space ahead. The park was not large, but it was alive in the way small neighborhood spaces often are. Children moving between swings and slides, parents watching from benches, conversations blending into a low, steady hum, and Ethan stood at the edge for a second, taking it in, understanding immediately that this was not his environment, not a space where his presence carried any inherent authority, and then he saw them. Naomi stood near a bench, her posture relaxed, her attention on Caleb, who was seated on the grass nearby, his small hands occupied with something just out of view. And the scene felt almost identical to the one he had witnessed in the house, simple, grounded, complete without him. Ethan approached slowly, not wanting to disrupt the moment, and Naomi noticed him before Caleb did, her gaze lifting briefly, acknowledging his presence without changing her expression, without signaling anything beyond awareness. "You came," she said when he reached them, her tone neutral, not surprised, not impressed, just stating a fact, and Ethan nodded once. "I said I would," he replied, his voice calm, and she held his gaze for a second longer before shifting her attention back to Caleb, as if the conversation did not require more than that. Ethan looked down at the child, who was now focused on a small plastic shovel, pushing dirt into a loose pile with careful concentration, and for a moment he did not speak, did not try to insert himself into the interaction. He simply stood there, observing, understanding that this was not a space he could enter by force, only by presence. Caleb glanced up after a few seconds, his eyes landing on Ethan with the same curiosity as before, and he paused, his hand still holding the shovel, as if considering something he did not yet have the words to express. And then he looked back down, continuing what he was doing without hesitation, the moment passing without recognition, but also without resistance. Ethan exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, and he stepped closer, lowering himself to sit on the edge of the bench Naomi had been standing near, his posture open but contained, his attention steady, and, for the first time, he allowed himself to simply be there, not directing, not questioning, not trying to accelerate what could not be rushed, just present, in a space that did not belong to him, with people who did not yet include him. And as the morning continued around them, the sounds of the park blending into a quiet backdrop, he understood that this, more than anything else, was where it began, not with a realization, not with a decision, but with showing up and staying. The morning did not rush them, and that was the first difference Ethan noticed as the minutes stretched without pressure, without expectation, the park continuing in its steady rhythm, while Caleb remained focused on something as simple as a patch of dirt and a small plastic shovel. And for a man who had spent years measuring time and outcomes and results, the lack of urgency felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting. But he did not interrupt it, did not try to shape it into something else. He simply stayed where he was, seated at the edge of the bench, his attention resting on the small movements unfolding just a few feet away. Naomi stood nearby, her posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly at her side, her gaze shifting between Caleb and the space around them with the quiet awareness of someone used to watching everything at once. And she did not direct Ethan, did not instruct him on what to do or how to engage. She simply allowed him to exist within the moment, to find his place without guidance, and that in itself carried weight. Caleb pushed the shovel forward again, gathering a small pile of loose dirt, then paused, his eyes lifting briefly as if checking something unseen, and this time when he looked up, his gaze lingered on Ethan a second longer than before, not fully recognition, but not entirely indifference either, something in between, something beginning, and Ethan felt it, subtle but real, and instead of speaking, instead of breaking the moment with words that might not belong, he reached down slowly, picking up a small stick that had fallen near the bench, and with a careful motion, he drew a simple line in the dirt a few inches away from Caleb's pile. The movement was quiet, unannounced, but it was enough to shift Caleb's attention, the child's eyes moving from his own pile to the new line, his head tilting slightly as he considered it, and then he reached out with the shovel, dragging more dirt toward the line, extending it without hesitation, as if the action itself made sense without needing explanation. Ethan watched closely, not interfering, not correcting, just responding in kind, adding another small line, this time forming a shape that was simple but intentional, and Caleb followed again, his movements growing more deliberate, more engaged, the space between them slowly filling with something that did not require language. Naomi observed quietly, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight easing that was almost imperceptible, because what she was witnessing was not a claim or a demand. It was a presence, a willingness to meet the child where he was rather than pulling him into something unfamiliar, and that mattered more than anything Ethan could have said. The sounds of the park continued around them, children laughing near the swings, a dog barking in the distance, the low murmur of conversation from other parents, but within that small space, the focus remained contained, steady, and for the first time, Ethan felt something that resembled alignment, not control, not certainty, but a sense that he was not entirely outside of this moment. He likes patterns, Naomi said after a while, her voice quiet, not interrupting the interaction but adding context, and Ethan nodded slightly, his eyes still on Caleb as the child adjusted the line again, pressing the dirt down with careful concentration. "So do I," Ethan replied, the words simple, but carrying a connection that felt genuine rather than strategic, and Naomi's gaze flickered toward him briefly, not with surprise, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the attempt to relate without overreaching. Caleb made a small sound then, something closer to a word than before, his voice carrying a soft emphasis as he tapped the shovel against the dirt line, and Naomi leaned slightly closer, her attention sharpening. "Line," she prompted gently, her tone encouraging but patient, and Caleb repeated the sound, clearer this time, the word forming with effort but landing, and Ethan felt something shift again, deeper than before, because it was not just the word itself, it was the moment of it, the way it happened naturally, without pressure, and he had been there to witness it. "Line," Ethan echoed quietly, not to correct or instruct, but to reinforce, his voice low, matching the tone Naomi had used, and Caleb's eyes flicked toward him again, this time with a hint of recognition, not of identity, but of sound, of repetition, of something that connected across the small distance between them. The interaction remained simple, grounded, but it carried a quiet momentum, the kind that builds without being forced, and Ethan did not rush it, did not try to expand it into something more than it was, because he was beginning to understand that these moments were not stepping stones to something bigger, they were the thing itself, the foundation that would either exist or not depending on how consistently he showed up for them. Time moved forward without announcement, the position of the sun shifting slightly, the air warming just enough to soften the edge of the morning, and Naomi checked the time with a quick glance at her phone before returning her attention to Caleb. 5 more minutes, she said softly, her voice carrying a gentle finality, and Caleb did not resist, did not argue. He simply continued what he was doing with the quiet acceptance of someone who trusted the structure around him. Ethan noticed that too, the ease with which the transition was accepted, and he recognized that it came from repetition, from knowing what to expect, from having been guided through the same pattern enough times that it no longer felt like a disruption. When the 5 minutes passed, Naomi crouched down beside Caleb, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Time to go," she said, her tone calm, consistent, and Caleb paused, his gaze moving between the lines they had drawn and his mother, and for a second it seemed like he might resist, but then he pushed the shovel into the ground one last time and let it go, standing with a small, steady movement that spoke of understanding more than compliance. Ethan stood as well, his motion slower, deliberate, and he watched as Naomi brushed the dirt from Caleb's hands, her movements gentle but efficient, preparing him to leave without breaking the rhythm of what had just happened. Caleb looked at Ethan again then, his eyes clearer now, more focused, and he hesitated for a brief second before making a small, tentative wave with his hand, the gesture unsteady but intentional, and Ethan felt it, the shift from curiosity to acknowledgement, however small it was. He returned the gesture without hesitation, his own movement controlled but sincere, and Naomi observed the exchange without comment, her expression steady, but there was no need for words, because the moment had already spoken for itself. They walked toward the edge of the park together, not side by side, but not entirely separate either, the distance between them smaller than before, defined not by position but by presence. And when they reached the sidewalk, Naomi turned slightly, her gaze meeting Ethan's once more. "Same time tomorrow," she said, her tone neutral, but the meaning behind it clear, and Ethan nodded once, not with urgency, not with relief, but with a quiet certainty that this was how it would be, not a single decision, not a grand gesture, but a series of moments, repeated, consistent, building something that could not be rushed. And as he watched them walk away, Caleb's small hand wrapped securely in Naomi's. He understood that for the first time, he was not chasing a result, he was learning to stay. The next morning arrived with a quiet sense of inevitability, not because anything dramatic had been promised, but because something had already begun, something that required continuation rather than anticipation, and Ethan felt it the moment he opened his eyes, the awareness settling in before his thoughts fully formed, before the habits of his usual routine could take over, and for the first time in a long time, his day did not begin with a checklist or a set of priorities defined by numbers and outcomes. It began with a place, a time, and a simple commitment to be there. The city moved as it always did, the early light catching on glass and steel, the low hum of traffic building into something steady and familiar. But Ethan's attention did not scatter across the demands waiting for him. It remained focused, anchored to a small park in Brooklyn where a child would be expecting nothing and everything at the same time, and that difference mattered more than anything else. He arrived earlier than he needed to, not out of impatience, but out of a quiet understanding that being late was not an option, not in a space where time was not negotiated but trusted, and he stood near the edge of the park again, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture composed but less rigid than it once had been, his gaze moving across the space with a calm awareness that felt different from observation, more like presence. The park carried the same rhythm as the day before, children moving through their own small worlds, parents watching with quiet attention, the air holding that same balance of movement and stillness, and Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward too soon, not assuming his place had been secured by his arrival, because he understood now that presence was not claimed, it was recognized over time. When Naomi and Caleb appeared, it was not with any announcement, just a continuation of something already in motion, her stride steady, Caleb's small hand in hers, his steps slightly uneven but confident in the way young children move when they trust the direction they are being led, and Ethan felt a subtle shift as he watched them approach, not tension, not uncertainty, but something closer to readiness, the kind that comes from showing up once and choosing to show up again. Naomi noticed him first, her gaze lifting briefly, acknowledging without altering her pace. And when they reached the open space near the grass, she released Caleb's hand, allowing him to move forward on his own, and he did, his attention already shifting to the ground, to the same patch of dirt where the lines from the day before had been smoothed over by time and movement, erased without effort, waiting to be drawn again. Ethan stepped closer this time, not as a calculated move, but as a natural progression from where they had left off, and he crouched down a few feet away, picking up the same kind of small stick, his movements slow, deliberate, and Caleb noticed, his eyes lifting with a spark of recognition that was not yet complete, but no longer absent. And without hesitation, he moved closer, the distance between them shrinking in a way that did not feel forced. The first line Ethan drew was simple, a continuation of what they had done before, and Caleb responded immediately, his small hands gripping the shovel with more confidence now, his movements less tentative, and the exchange resumed without words, without introduction, as if the moment had been paused rather than ended the day before. Naomi stood nearby, her posture relaxed, her attention steady, and she did not intervene, did not guide. She simply observed, allowing the interaction to unfold at its own pace, because she understood that this was where it mattered, not in what was said, but in what was repeated, in what became familiar through consistency rather than explanation. Line, Caleb said suddenly, the word clearer than before, his voice carrying a small sense of certainty as he tapped the ground, and Ethan looked at him, not with surprise, but with a quiet acknowledgement that felt earned rather than given. Line, Ethan echoed, his tone matching, reinforcing without overwhelming, and Caleb smiled slightly, the expression brief but real, his attention returning to the dirt with a renewed focus that carried the memory of the word with it. The moment settled into something steady again, the rhythm of their interaction finding its place within the larger movement of the park, and Ethan remained grounded in it, not reaching beyond what was there, not trying to accelerate the connection, because he understood now that this was not about proving anything. It was about building something that could only exist if it was allowed to form naturally. Time moved forward, marked not by the clock but by the subtle shifts in light, in sound, in the way Caleb's energy began to change, his movements slowing slightly, his attention drifting more frequently, and Naomi stepped in at the right moment, her voice calm, consistent. 5 more minutes, she said again, the same words as before, the same tone, and Caleb responded the same way, not resisting, not questioning, simply accepting, because the pattern had been established, and Ethan noticed that too, the reliability of it, the way trust formed not from explanation but from repetition. When the time came to leave, the transition happened smoothly, Naomi guiding Caleb with the same gentle efficiency, brushing the dirt from his hands, adjusting his jacket, preparing him to move on without disrupting the calm that had settled over the interaction, and Ethan stood, his movements aligned with theirs, not leading, not following, but present within the same flow. Caleb looked up at him again, his eyes clearer now, more focused, and this time when he raised his hand, the gesture was more certain, the small wave steady, intentional, and Ethan returned it without hesitation, his own movement matching the child's in a way that felt simple but significant, because it was no longer tentative, it was recognized. Naomi met Ethan's gaze briefly, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift there, something that acknowledged the consistency of his presence, not as a reward, not as approval, but as a fact that had been observed more than once. Tomorrow, she said, the word carrying the same weight as before, and Ethan nodded, his response quiet, steady, because he understood now that this was the language of what they were building, not promises, not declarations, just time, repeated, consistent, and as they turned to leave, Caleb's hand finding Naomi's again, Ethan remained for a moment longer, watching them go, not with urgency, not with regret, but with a quiet certainty that he would be there again, that this would continue, not because he had decided it once, but because he would decide it every time, and that was the difference that mattered. The pattern continued not because it was easy, but because it was chosen, and by the third morning, the familiarity of the route to Brooklyn had begun to settle into something steady for Ethan, no longer a disruption to his routine but a part of it, something that existed alongside the structure he had built rather than in conflict with it. And as the car slowed near the park, he noticed that he was no longer scanning the space with uncertainty, no longer searching for where he fit. He simply stepped out and moved toward the same patch of ground where the previous days had unfolded, his presence quieter now, less defined by observation and more by participation. The park greeted him the same way it always did, the low hum of activity, the soft rhythm of movement, and he reached the edge of the grass just as Naomi and Caleb approached from the opposite side. Their timing aligned without coordination, as if the routine had already begun to form its own logic, its own unspoken agreement. Naomi acknowledged him with the same brief glance, her expression composed, but there was no longer any question in it, no assessment of whether he would come, only the recognition that he had, and Caleb, still holding her hand, looked up and then forward again, his steps carrying him closer without hesitation, without the pause that had marked their first meeting. When Naomi released his hand, Caleb moved directly toward the ground, toward the familiar space, and Ethan followed, crouching down at a distance that had grown smaller with each day, the invisible boundary between them shifting not by decision but by repetition. This time, Caleb did not wait for Ethan to draw the first line. He pressed the shovel into the dirt immediately, forming a rough shape with focused intent, and then he looked up, not with uncertainty, but with expectation, his eyes landing on Ethan with a clarity that had not been there before. "Line," Caleb said, the word firm now, no longer tentative, and Ethan responded without delay, his voice matching the tone. "Line," he echoed, and he picked up the stick again, adding to the shape Caleb had started, his movements smooth, measured, creating a simple pattern that extended outward rather than correcting what was already there. Caleb followed, his small hands working with more confidence, the exchange flowing more naturally, and for the first time, there was a rhythm to it that felt shared. Rather than initiated, something that belonged to both of them equally in that moment. Naomi watched from a step away, her posture relaxed, her attention steady, and she did not need to intervene, did not need to guide, because what she was seeing did not require adjustment. It was forming on its own, built on the consistency of the previous days, on the simple act of showing up without expectation. The sounds of the park seemed to fade slightly, not because they had changed, but because Ethan's focus had narrowed, his attention anchored fully in the small space in front of him, in the way Caleb's movements mirrored his own, in the way the child's gaze returned to him more frequently now, not just observing, but engaging, and it was in that shift that something deeper began to take shape, something that could not be forced, only recognized. Again, Caleb said suddenly, the new word emerging with effort but clarity, his eyes lifting briefly as he pointed to the line they had just formed, and Ethan felt it, the significance of the moment landing quietly but firmly, because this was not just repetition, it was communication, it was intention expressed in a way that reached across the space between them. Again, Ethan repeated, his tone steady, and he drew another line, slightly different this time, extending the pattern outward, and Caleb followed without hesitation, his small hands working with growing coordination, the connection between them strengthening in a way that did not require explanation. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, not in a way that changed her expression, but in the way her shoulders eased, the subtle shift of someone who recognized progress without needing to name it, and she remained where she was, allowing the moment to continue without interruption, because she understood that this was where trust was built, not in words, but in consistency, in the quiet reliability of presence. Time moved forward as it always did, the light shifting across the grass, the air warming just enough to soften the edge of the morning, and Caleb's energy began to shift with it, his movements slowing slightly, his attention drifting in small intervals, and Naomi stepped in at the right moment again, her voice calm, familiar. 5 more minutes, she said, the same words, the same tone, and Caleb responded as he had before, not resisting, not questioning, simply accepting, because the pattern had been established, and Ethan noticed that too. The way trust formed through repetition, through knowing what would come next without needing to ask. When the time came to leave, the transition unfolded smoothly, Naomi guiding Caleb with the same gentle efficiency, brushing his hands clean, adjusting his jacket, preparing him to move on, and Ethan stood, his posture aligned with theirs, his presence no longer uncertain, no longer tentative, but still careful, still aware of the space he occupied. Caleb looked up at him again, his eyes clearer than before, and this time when he raised his hand, it was not just a wave, it was a small, deliberate reach, his fingers opening as if offering something more than a gesture, and Ethan responded instinctively, extending his hand in return, his movement slow but certain, and for a brief moment, Caleb's small fingers closed around his, the contact light but intentional, the kind of connection that carried weight far beyond its simplicity. The moment did not last long, Caleb's attention shifting back to Naomi as she adjusted his coat. But it was enough, more than enough, because it marked something that had not existed before, something that had been built one day at a time, one moment at a time, without force, without demand. Naomi met Ethan's gaze briefly, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet acknowledgement there, something that recognized not just his presence, but his consistency, and she nodded slightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that carried more meaning than any words she could have spoken. "Tomorrow," she said again, her tone steady, and Ethan nodded, his response just as quiet, just as certain, because he understood now that this was not a question, not a request, it was a continuation, and as he watched them walk away once more, Caleb's small hand secure in Naomi's, he realized that what he had once thought of as control had been replaced by something else. Entirely, something slower, something less predictable, but far more real, and for the first time, he did not need to understand every part of it to know that he would keep showing up, because that was where everything now began. By the fourth morning, the routine no longer felt like something fragile, something that could break if handled too quickly. It had settled into a quiet certainty, not because anything had been promised, but because everything had been repeated, and Ethan arrived at the park with a steadiness that did not come from confidence, but from consistency, his steps measured, his presence calm, his attention already aligned with the small space where something real had been building day by day. The air carried a softer warmth now, the early chill fading as the season shifted, and the park moved with its usual rhythm, children scattered across the grass, parents watching with quiet attentiveness, the low hum of life unfolding without urgency, and Ethan stepped into it without hesitation, no longer pausing at the edge, no longer questioning where he belonged, because he understood now that belonging was not something granted in a moment, it was something formed through presence. Naomi and Caleb appeared shortly after, their timing once again aligned without discussion, her stride steady, Caleb's small steps more confident than before, his hand still held in hers, but his attention already moving ahead, scanning the ground as if searching for the place he knew they would go. And when she released him, he moved immediately toward the familiar patch of dirt, not looking back this time, not waiting to see if Ethan would follow, because the pattern had already been set. Ethan crouched down beside him, closer than before, the space between them reduced to something that felt natural rather than measured, and Caleb glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting Ethan's with a recognition that was no longer uncertain, no longer tentative, but still quiet, still unfolding in its own way. "Line," Caleb said again, the word now part of his rhythm, his small hands already moving, pressing the shovel into the dirt with purpose, and Ethan responded without delay, picking up the stick, extending the pattern they had built over the past days, his movements smooth, deliberate, and Caleb followed without hesitation, their actions sinking in a way that no longer required thought. Naomi watched from nearby, her posture relaxed, her attention steady, and there was something different in the way she stood now, not just observation, but a quiet acceptance of what she was seeing, the gradual formation of something she had not interfered with, something she had allowed to grow on its own terms. "Circle," Caleb said suddenly, the new word emerging with effort but determination, his small finger tracing a rough shape in the dirt, and Ethan paused for a brief second, recognizing the shift, the expansion of what they were building, not just repetition now, but variation, and he nodded slightly. "Circle," Ethan repeated, his voice calm, reinforcing without overwhelming, and he adjusted his movement, drawing a simple round shape beside Caleb's line, and Caleb followed, his shovel moving in a wide, uneven arc, but with clear intention, and when he looked up again, there was a small spark of satisfaction in his eyes, something that had not been there before. The moment held steady, not dramatic, not loud, but significant in its own quiet way, and Ethan felt it, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual shift, the understanding that this was no longer about being allowed to be present. It was about becoming part of the pattern itself, part of the routine that Caleb was beginning to recognize, and that difference mattered more than anything else. The sounds of the park drifted in and out. Children laughing, the distant creak of swings, a dog running past with quick, light steps. But within that small space, the focus remained anchored, the exchange between them continuing without interruption, without the need for words beyond what Caleb offered. And Ethan followed that lead, responding only when necessary, allowing the moment to shape itself. Naomi stepped a little closer after a while, not intervening, but observing more directly, her gaze moving between them with a quiet assessment that was no longer guarded, no longer measuring risk, but acknowledging change. And when Caleb shifted slightly, leaning closer to Ethan as he adjusted his position, she did not move to correct it, did not pull him back, she simply allowed it to happen, and that, more than anything else, marked a shift that could not be undone. 5 more minutes, Naomi said eventually, her voice the same, calm, consistent, the pattern holding, and Caleb responded as he always had, not resisting, not questioning, his trust in the structure surrounding him evident in the ease of his acceptance, and Ethan recognized that too. The way trust formed not from promises, but from repetition, from knowing what would come next without needing to be told. When the time came to leave, the transition unfolded with the same quiet efficiency, Naomi guiding Caleb, brushing the dirt from his hands, adjusting his jacket, and Ethan stood, his movements aligned with theirs, his presence no longer an addition, but a part of the flow, and as they moved toward the edge of the park, Caleb looked up at him again, his gaze steady, his expression thoughtful in the way children often are when they are processing something new. This time, when he reached out, it was not just a wave, it was a small, deliberate step closer, his hand extending fully, and Ethan responded immediately, meeting the gesture with a careful, steady motion, their hands connecting in a way that felt both simple and significant, the contact lasting just a second longer than before, enough to register, enough to matter. Naomi watched the exchange without comment, but her posture shifted slightly, her shoulders easing in a way that suggested something had settled, something had reached a point where it no longer needed to be questioned. And when Caleb stepped back, returning to her side, she placed her hand gently on his shoulder, grounding him in the same way she always had. "Tomorrow," she said again, her voice steady. But there was something different beneath it now, not just continuation, but acknowledgement, and Ethan nodded, his response quiet, but firm, because he understood that this was not just about showing up anymore. It was about staying, about being part of something that had already begun to include him, not by demand, not by right, but by presence. And as he watched them walk away once more, Caleb's small hand finding Naomi's, he realized that the truth he had discovered was no longer just something he had to face. It was something he was beginning to live, one day at a time. The 5th morning did not announce itself as anything different, but the difference was already there, settled into the rhythm of what had been built, and Ethan felt it the moment he stepped out of the car, the park no longer an unfamiliar space, no longer a place he entered with caution, but somewhere that held a quiet sense of continuity, as if the moments from the previous days had not disappeared overnight, but waited, steady and patient, for him to return. The air carried a gentle warmth now, the early chill replaced by something softer, and the sounds of the park blended into a calm, familiar backdrop, children moving through their routines, parents watching with quiet ease, and Ethan walked toward the same patch of grass without hesitation, his steps measured but natural, his attention already focused on what would come next, not with expectation, but with readiness. Naomi and Caleb appeared again, their timing aligned in that unspoken way that had become part of the pattern, her posture steady, Caleb's small steps more confident than ever, his gaze already scanning the ground, as if he knew exactly where they would go. And when she released his hand, he moved forward without looking back, his focus set, his movements purposeful in a way that spoke of familiarity rather than curiosity. Ethan crouched beside him, closer now, the distance between them no longer defined by uncertainty, and Caleb looked up immediately, his eyes meeting Ethan's with something clear, something that no longer needed time to form, and for a brief moment, the space between them held that recognition, quiet but undeniable. "Circle," Caleb said, the word coming easily now, his small hands already moving to shape the dirt, and Ethan nodded, responding without delay, his stick tracing a simple arc beside the child's movement, their actions aligning without effort, without hesitation. And the pattern they created grew more fluid, more connected, each line and shape building on the last without interruption. Naomi stood nearby, her presence steady, her gaze no longer measuring or assessing, but simply observing, and there was a calm in her posture that had not been there before, a quiet acceptance of what she was seeing, the gradual formation of something that had moved beyond possibility into reality. The minutes passed in that steady rhythm, the exchange between Ethan and Caleb unfolding with a natural ease that did not require words. And when Caleb paused, looking up with a thoughtful expression, his small voice followed, clearer than it had ever been. Again, he said, the word deliberate, directed not just at the action, but at the connection itself, and Ethan felt it, the shift in meaning, the expansion of what had been built, and he responded with the same calm certainty. Again, he repeated, his tone steady, and he drew another shape, slightly different, extending the pattern outward, and Caleb followed immediately, his movements confident, his attention fully engaged, and for the first time, it felt less like an interaction and more like a shared activity, something that belonged equally to both of them. The park moved around them as it always did, the sounds of life continuing without pause, but within that small space, there was a stillness, a focus that held steady, and Ethan remained anchored in it, not looking beyond what was there, not reaching for something more, because he understood now that this was the foundation, not a step towards something else, but the thing itself. Naomi stepped closer after a while, her presence near enough to feel, and when Caleb shifted slightly, leaning toward Ethan again, she did not intervene, did not redirect, she simply allowed it, her trust in the moment evident in the absence of action, and Ethan noticed that too, the way her stillness spoke louder than any words could have. 5 more minutes, Naomi said eventually, her voice carrying the same calm consistency, and Caleb responded as he always had, his trust in the pattern evident in the ease of his acceptance, and Ethan recognized the significance of that as well, the way consistency created space for understanding, for comfort, for connection that did not need to be explained. When the time came to leave, the transition unfolded smoothly, Naomi guiding Caleb with the same gentle efficiency, brushing the dirt from his hands, adjusting his jacket, and Ethan stood, his movements aligned with theirs, his presence now part of the rhythm rather than an addition to it. Caleb looked up at him again, his eyes steady, and this time, there was no hesitation, no pause, his small hand lifting and reaching fully toward Ethan with a certainty that had not been there before, and Ethan responded immediately, his hand meeting Caleb's in a motion that felt natural, their fingers closing together with a quiet, steady connection that held for a moment longer than before, long enough to register, long enough to matter. Ethan, Caleb said then, the name forming with effort but clarity, the sound simple, but carrying a weight that settled deeply, and Ethan felt it, not as a sudden impact, but as something that filled the space within him completely, the recognition no longer one-sided, no longer abstract, but real, spoken, acknowledged. Naomi's gaze lifted, meeting Ethan's, and for the first time, there was something in her expression that had not been there before, not guarded, not distant, but quietly open, a recognition that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and she nodded slightly, a small gesture that carried more meaning than anything she could have said. Tomorrow, she said again, her voice steady, but now there was something more within it, something that acknowledged not just continuation, but belonging, and Ethan nodded, his response calm, certain, because he understood now that this was no longer about proving anything, no longer about earning a place. It was about being there, consistently, without question, without condition, and as he watched them walk away, Caleb's small hand finding Naomi's once more, he remained for a moment longer. The park moving around him, the city continuing its rhythm, but within him, something had settled into place, something that did not need to be defined or measured, only lived, one day at a time, and for the first time, that was enough.